Hey guys, this is Smart Bomb from Western New York Airsoft League again, and what I have here is a Transkei Defence Force uniform. What you see right now is the jacket, which I picked up from Trident Military about 3 or 4 years ago with the intention of using it as a uniform for airsoft games, just as something different from the typical woodland or desert patterns that you would typically see around in this area. And it cost me about, I want to say about $80 for the uniform at the time, which is not bad by any means, especially for a foreign uniform, considering that most modern new uniforms, whether they be BDUs or ACUs or what have you, will run you around there if you're not buying them from a surplus store or something like that. The background of this uniform is that it was used by the Transkei Defence Force, Transkei being a quasi-independent nation within South Africa that was basically promoted as an independent black homeland by the apartheid government at the time. It was granted independence in 1976, and I want to say this was probably used from the very beginning. The country, I believe, was reintegrated into South Africa in 1994 or somewhere in the early 90s. So this pattern really was not in use for very long, uh, less than 20 years. And as a result, it's not very well known. Um, but it is an interesting uniform, as I'll point out. It's got some interesting features to it and some interesting history behind it. Um, but I'm going to talk about the pattern first, and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here to give you a better idea of it. And you can see some of the splotches and some of the larger brown patterning alongside the overall sort of khaki background to it. And this pattern was most likely originated from the success and widespread use of French lizard pattern and Portuguese vertical lizard, which is in itself a derivative of French lizard, which worked well, from what I understand, in southern Africa, just because it would cover the sort of lush vegetation that you can find in certain areas. But this pattern also has some tannish and dark brown elements to it, as you can see, which may have been a concession to some of the drier, flatter areas, which also predominate in South Africa and in the southern African region. The pattern is, like I said, very similar to these lizard patterns, but it's not quite as wavy. It's got more blotches and blackier patterns than the tiger stripe style of the lizard patterns, which again is probably a an attempt to maintain the utility of the pattern but not have it confused with the lizard patterns, which were in use by a lot of the independence movements at the time. So I'm sure they wanted to differentiate it to some degree, but the patterning is good. It actually works fairly well in the upper state New York area, and which is kind of surprising considering it is um, an African camouflage. The reasoning for this is, especially in like the spring and fall seasons, the dry vegetation and the dead leaves and stuff like that fits very well with the color scheme. So that was an interesting surprise. Also, and I don't know if this is just a natural progression of how fabric fades or the somewhat infantile production processes that were available to such a small country, that this uniform will fade a bit, and it actually makes it a little bit more blended to its environment. The colors aren't so vibrant, and that's definitely a good thing. So what I will do now is run over the basic features of this jacket, which I also have another full set of this stuff minus the hat, which includes the jacket, the pants, and a field shirt. The field shirt's very similar to this. It just has two upper pockets as opposed to the four that we'll see here, and a couple other real minor features, but it didn't really bear me reviewing it, and I don't have it readily available right now anyway, so I'm just gonna gloss over that at this point and just run over the jacket in more detail. We'll go to the basic stuff, which is, you know, the typical epaulettes, single button and eyelet closure, one on each side. The front closure, you can see, uses the same kind of plastic disc buttons. It's a 4-button closure, and that's decent. The one thing I do like is that there's a button pretty much right at the bottom, so it closes up nicely, as opposed to the US BDU cut, which this bottom area is sort of flapping around if it's not tucked in. I mean, it's really a minor point, but it's just a personal preference that I enjoy. The cover flap does have a storm flap to it, so the buttons are covered, very similar to US M81. However, you will notice on these two top pockets and these two waist pockets, which are also closed by button and eyelet fasteners, the buttons are exposed, which is interesting considering the brush and the heavy vegetation that these guys were perhaps expected to sludge through, and I imagine that would cause some issues in terms of snagging. So that's an interesting, I don't know if it was a design feature they just didn't think about, or it was something they didn't have the money to put into the extra fabric that was required, but it is an interesting omission that I would have expected they would have covered the buttons. Other than that, the arms are a little interesting. They've just got a single button and eyelet closure. This is in the fasten position, and this one is in the open position. You can see a slit here to facilitate rolling the sleeves up if needed. Then I'm going to roll up here. You can see this stitched area. This is actually slightly padded, elbow pads. This is somewhat similar, if I have seen correctly in some of the illustrations that I've seen. This is very similar to the Portuguese vertical lizard jacket that had similar padded elbows to it. Running back to the pockets again real quick, these are, I would say, almost identical in size to US BDU size pockets. The chest pockets are maybe a little bit deeper, and the waist pockets are a little bit shallower, but overall very, very similar in dimension. I don't have a quarter handy right now, so I can't do an exact size comparison, but they are very similar. The stitching's actually very similar. The one interesting thing is, though, that these are flat stitched as opposed to having a bellow to them, so they don't expand when they have more material in them, which is somewhat typical of non-US uniforms, and it's not a big deal. I'm just going to open this up real quick and just look at the inside here. The inside, you can see this is a little bit elasticized, not very much, but a little bit. It's an interesting choice. And perhaps it's not even elasticized, maybe it's just a natural give of the fabric, but the reasoning that I find that interesting is, and we'll see this on the pants, a lot of ex-Rhodesians came to Transkei to help build their defense force after the loss of the country to the Zanu rebels in 1980, and a lot of their features seem to have come from their uniforms, which did have the elasticized um, top to their waist pouch or waist pockets, and that's interesting to see um, as a design choice that they've made. And other than that, we'll just open this up real quick. You'll see this heavy brown background to the jacket, which apparently the different types of this have different colored backing to them. Some of them are more of a khaki color, some of them are this brown color. This one was actually made by Sun Manufacturers, if you can see that tag. And there's a couple different ones that made them. I think Dux and Sow were two different manufacturers that also made this pattern in addition to Sun. Not sure if these were Transkei native manufacturers or if these were South African manufacturers. Doing a Google search there might have helped, but I don't even know if they exist anymore. The last interesting feature is this drawstring waist to cinch up the waist area if the wearer so chooses. You'll see this red stuff here. This is just tape I've added because the original nylon drawstring was not melted to prevent fraying, so I just put tape on there to preserve the original integrity of it without ruining it too much. What I'm going to talk about last is something I don't usually talk about in these, which is the stitching. The stitching is decent. I'm going to try and focus in here. You'll see there's a double line of stitches right here and right here. But, and that's pretty typical. But the issue is, and again, I'll try and focus in on these, you'll see this large concentration of green thread, which is not the original thread. The original thread is this more color matched tan brown. And the reasoning for that is I actually re-sewed all of the buttons on here because they were getting pretty loose after only a little bit of use. This, again, I'm not sure if it's an issue of their burgeoning manufacturing processes or just a difference in manufacturing processes. I don't know. But the buttons were getting very loose very quickly, so I restitched them, and you'll see I had to restitch a couple other areas on the pants as well. But the overall actual stitching is fine. Stitching in the pockets, all the major stitching on, connecting the arms to the jacket, the main area of it, the stitching on the elbows, all that stuff's fine. It was just the buttons were very, very loose with this brown thread that I wasn't real wild about. So I restitched those, which again, you're not going to run into that with an M81 BDU. The tailoring process in the U.S. has been very much refined and ruggedized to the point where you never really have to worry about having to do a resew unless you're modifying the uniform or something like that. I am going to switch this off and go on to part 2 of the pants here in 1 second, and we'll continue the review of the Transkei Defence Force, I guess brush pattern is what we'll call it.